So, thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be in Uruguay. It was actually a very difficult flight. Every flight was delayed, so I'm happy that I actually made it here, first of all. So to tell you a little bit about myself, my name's Mike AbiEzzi. I work in Boulder, Colorado for a consulting company called QuickLeft. QuickLeft builds web and mobile applications. We also have offices in Portland, Oregon, and San Francisco. I've been doing this I've been consulting for over 10 years. I've been developing software for over 15 years. So today I'm going to talk about how to build complex domains in Rails. It's been one of the biggest trouble points for a lot of my clients. When you grow a model over time and it gets bigger and bigger, if you don't put certain things in place, it starts to get out of control and unmaintainable. So this talk is based off of a book called Domain-Driven Design. It was pioneered by Eric Evans. The way Eric Evans puts it is DDD is an approach on developing software with a focus on the domain. So you're developing software, and the whole time your focus is, how are we modeling this domain that we're building the software for? Who here is familiar with domain-driven design? Awesome. So about 20, 30%. So first, what's a domain? One example is Twitter. It's a microblogging service. Another example is a doctor's office. Another example is an auto mechanic shop. So, and actually, fourth example is an app store, just like iOS's app store. And finally, my favorite example is maybe somebody that wants to collect cat gifts. Just enjoy it for a little bit. So now we know what a domain is. It's a business sector or an idea that you're trying to build software for. So why do we even care about domain-driven design? Simply put, software gets complex fast. So if you're building a Rails project, you might start out with just a few models, and it's pretty simple. And then you start adding more models. Maybe you have a dozen by now. And then you add a team member, and maybe another team member, and now you have 50 models. And then over 6 months, now you have 100 models. And your simple Rails application started out simple, but it starts to get complex. And everyone's trying to do the right Rails thing, but nobody was really focusing on the domain. So I looked online, and I found an example of a domain diagram that was kind of big and bloated, relationships everywhere. And it made me think how I feel when I look at something like this, when I get into a client's project for the first time. And to summarize it, it makes me feel like it's a train wreck, to be honest, and I just entered a train wreck. Nobody really paid attention to things as it grew. So nobody wants a train wreck of models, and that's why Eric Evans essentially created domain-driven design. So who knows what this is? It's a Rails project. What does it tell you about your domain? It doesn't. It tells you it's a Rails project. So we're going to use this as a baseline, and we're going to try to improve it as we talk about building this Rails application. But first, let's get some basics out of the way. So DDD is made up of two core concepts. You have communication and how the domain is communicated. On top of that, you have architecture. I like to use the analogy of climbing a mountain. So if you're climbing a mountain, the first easier part might be communication. It's fairly level. There's a little bit of gain, but you can get rolling very quickly. And the last part of climbing the mountain is doing the hard part, which is the architecture. So during this talk, I'm going to talk about the communication piece. Frankly, because it's easier, and you don't always want to roll out a custom architecture right away. Sometimes you need to work on your startup and make sure that it's even viable. So Rails is great for that, right? To kind of develop something very quickly. So we're going to not talk about architecture complexities. We're going to focus on communication, so you can go home right now and start putting some of these practices into place without getting worked up in the details of architecture. We're going to use an example as we talk about this domain. We're going to use the Apple App Store as our example. Say that we have VP of product coming to us, and they want to build an app store. So we have an app, we have a developer, developers create apps, apps have several versions, versions will have several screenshots associated with them. So when you look at an app in the App Store, you see those screenshots, and these numbers here, 1 to n, means you have one developer can have many apps, one app can have many versions, and one version can have 1 to 6 screenshots. And we have a customer, and customers can purchase apps, and customers can install specific versions of an app. And finally, customers can leave comments on their version. So say that we built this from an initial meeting with the VP of product at Apple, and it's just a really rough brainstorm of what the domain is. So let's keep that in mind and move on. So the things that we're going to talk about is how do you define the domain? How do you communicate the domain with your team? All the different relationships between models and why they matter and why some of them shouldn't be there. What aggregates are, what value objects are, what domain services are, and why data access is important. So let's go back to our domain. So I'm going to kind of simulate a dialogue. The domain expert, I'm going to call the VP of product our domain expert. He needs to be able to, he's talking about, this app or this app store needs to allow developers to create apps, and it needs to be easy. And then companies also need to create apps, and it also needs to be easy. And I'm looking at this, and I don't see any companies. So he was talking about developers and companies need to create an app. So I asked him, okay, do developers and companies both need to do essentially the same thing? And he says, yeah. I'm like, okay, great. So maybe developer is not the right term here. What's another term? And he talks about, I don't really know. I just know that we need certain entities to be able to sell this application. I'm like, oh, well, maybe we should call it seller. Cool. So we just changed that terminology, and now it matches the domain a little appropriately. We're going to go through this discussion some more. I'm going to speed through a couple things. So the version, it doesn't feel like that's the right word either. Version is really just an attribute on a release. So maybe this should be called release. And comment isn't really a comment because there's also a rating, and it's more complex than that, so we're going to call it a review. Cool. So let's look at this a little bit more. Looking at our purchase, we have two relationships. The customers can look at the apps that they purchased, and the app can look at all of the different purchases that customers made. But that second one, where the app is looking at all the customers that purchases made, do we really need that? Does the app really need to know that? I don't think so. For a customer, it makes sense. A customer would want to look at their purchases so that if they need to re-download an app, they can. So I'm going to remove the app to purchases relationship. And do customers really need to know, or do we need to track in the system that customers installed certain releases? So one design could be that the customers have apps installed on a device, and in order to figure out if you need more updates, it would just look at the apps installed and then ask the server, and the server would say, yeah, you need these to update. So I don't think we need to actually track installed, since it's already on the device and it's already handled for us. And then looking at customer and review. So does the customer really need to look at a list of its reviews? So the Apple App Store actually doesn't do this that I'm aware of. You can't actually say, hey, show me all my reviews. But if you leave a second review, it would replace the original review. So we got rid of several relationships. And what that did for us was that it cleaned up the domain by making it a little bit more expressive of exactly what the domain needs. And it also helped us remove complexities that we didn't need in the first place. If those complexities were there, it could actually prevent us from doing other things and refactoring things later down the line. So we talked a little bit about the communication. On one side, you have the domain expert. Our example was the VP of product at Apple. And then the other side, you have a software expert. This could be a lead developer. And you go through this iteration of brainstorming different domain concepts. You draw diagrams. You speak out assumptions. You let the domain expert correct you. And then you continually refine as you go along. So to sum up the two sides of the equation, on one side, the domain experts are supposed to object to terms or structures that are awkward or inadequate. We saw this as an example when, well, we kind of blew through it, but comments weren't really a good term. We changed that to reviews. And developers should watch for ambiguity or inconsistency. The developer, in our example, saw that the domain expert was using the word developer and company interchangeably. So it leads us to ubiquitous language. So ubiquitous language is a common, rigorous language between developers and users. And the need for it to be rigorous since software doesn't cope well with ambiguity. So from your user to your product owner to your domain expert to your designer to your developer all the way to your code, you want to ensure one consistent language across the whole team. So that means if your user is presented with new terminology, then your product owner needs to use that terminology down to your domain expert, designer, developer, and into your code. So basically, you want the same language all the time. You refactor, if one thing changes one place, then you need to refactor your code to reflect that language. All right, so we got past some of the core domain-driven design concepts. Let's go into some code and take a look at it. So say we want to submit a release of our application. We'll walk through this real quick. We're going to create a new release. It's going to have a major, minor, and build, version numbers. We're going to add a couple screenshots, and we're going to set the status to submitted. And then we're going to add that release to our app's releases. This is very typical Rails code that we're all familiar with seeing, but it's sometimes it's kind of just scattered all about. So how can we do this a better way? So one example is we can take all of that logic and put it into a submit release method. If you notice, the version number is in a very familiar format. It's very terse versus what we had in the above example. And the screenshots are also more terse. So we're describing a domain behavior with this method, but we're also making it easier to understand at first glance. It simplifies interaction for other developers that need to interact with this domain object. And it manages complexities of how you build all the different objects together. So we're starting to build an aggregate. App in our example is an aggregate root. We have releases, screenshots, and reviews. And if we look at the code for what an app model looks like, you can see that we have these high-level methods. So we have our submit release here. We also have these other methods: create release, approve release, flag for abuse, mark as staff favorite. It's summarizing what's important for an app, and it's allowing the app to organize all of the complexities within it and to kind of keep that away from anybody that has to use this domain object from having to worry about those details. And it also makes your domain more solid because all those details are built in and controlled in one place. And also, it tells a story of how your domain works. All right, so let's get through a couple more things. So there's entities and value objects. By default, everybody in Rails creates entities because when you create an active record object, that's an entity. An entity describes a thing, and an entity is a thing, and a value describes a thing. So we'll look at an example. In our domain that we're working with, customer is an entity, and name could be a value object. So some of the attributes of an entity: it has a life cycle, it can change state, and it's unique, independent of attributes. So to talk about that a little bit more, a customer could be active at one point, and then they could become deactive at another point. So it has a life cycle. Also, that represents state change. And it's also unique, independent of attributes. So my name's Mike AbiEzzi. I have a little cousin. His name is Mike AbiEzzi. And even though we have the same name, we're both still unique people. So the system needs to track some kind of unique identifier so that if the attributes are the same, it can distinguish the two from each other. And that's basically the premise of an entity, and that's what we're all familiar with. So we give it a surrogate ID. A value object is immutable. It doesn't reference anything, and most importantly, it avoids design complexities. So just like a string is a value object, you create a new instance, you use it, you might assign it to some other entity in your domain, but you don't actually, it doesn't have any behaviors other than maybe morphing it into a different string. But the important part is value objects avoid design complexities that entities have. And if you can distinguish what are value objects from entities, then you can start making your domain simpler and making it less rigid. So we'll look at our model again. What's an entity and what's a value object? So all aggregate roots are, by default, entities. The release is also an entity. We might go through a submitted stage, and then it goes into a approval stage, and then it goes into a release stage. The screenshot is a value object. There's 6 of them. If one screenshot is pointing to a file, and you replace it with another screenshot that points to a file, it doesn't matter, right? They're interchangeable. It doesn't affect anything. It's really just values that describe a release. And a review is also a value object. As customers leave reviews, they add on information about what the comment is and what the rating are, and that review doesn't change. If the customer wants to create a new review, what you do is you just delete the old review and then add the new review. So let's look at some examples of what a value object looks like. So we use screenshot as our example. We have an attribute reader for file and position, right? It's immutable. It shouldn't change, so you can only read the attributes. We also added an equality. So just as you might want to compare two strings together or two numbers together, you might want to compare two value objects together. And making it comparable is also good. You can include comparable, and essentially you can have some sort of equality. For example, say that you wanted to compare how one screenshot is ordered to another screenshot. So you would just compare the positions. So I just wanted to show that real quick because it is pretty simple and not many people realize how to create them. They're just basically they're just Ruby objects. So let's look at another example, version number. So version number has major, minor, and build. But we also have some nice utility factory methods that allow you to increment a version number by 1. Might not look like much, but instead of having your code scattered with new version number, major +1, minor, and build, you have everything together in one area, organized, and then there's just very simple methods that you're using in your controllers or other places in your code. All right, so we know what value objects look like. Now let's talk about how they persist. There's 3 ways. For one-to-one relationships, the simplest thing is inline in the entities table, and we'll show an example of that. For one-to-many or one-to-one relationships, you can, and I recommend it, serialize it on the entities table. A good example of this is a screenshot. So you have an array of screenshots. How are you going to save that on your release table? What you could do is you can serialize that into JSON, and then you can store that JSON on a screenshots field in your release table. And then the third option is in its own table, but when you put value objects, again, talk about screenshots, in their own table, then we're inheriting from active record to make that work. And it's very difficult to make value objects immutable in active record. So let's look at an example of storing a value object inline on the entity table. It's really simple. You just do a simple translation through methods. So we have an assignment method, and the version number major, version number minor, and version number build, those are going to be attributes on your release table. And then you just assign those to the values from your version number object. And in your version number reader, you're constructing a new version number value object, passing in the different major, minor, and build numbers from your release table. So you can also do this with composed of in Rails. It basically just facilitates that same thing, but makes it a little bit easier. This was deprecated at one point in time, but it's been redacted, so it's safe to use it. And it has mappings to map, okay, if you have a release table and you have these 3 attributes, version number major, version number minor, version number build, you want to map those to your version number object, major, minor, and build methods. Cool. So that sums up a value object, and I wanted to get it out of the way. One of the more interesting parts of DDD are services. So we're going to look at an example of gifting an app. So say that I want to gift an app to somebody else. So I need to do 2 things, right? Or the system needs to do 2 things. It needs to charge me, the gifter, for the purchase, and then it needs to assign access rights to the giftee. So we need something to facilitate this transaction because both the gifter and giftee are customers of their own aggregate instances, and they shouldn't know about each other. So let's go back to our domain model, refine it a little bit. Before we just had a purchase, we're going to add an access right now so that we can separate a purchase from to be assigned to a customer that made the purchase, and then have an access right for the customer that can access the app. So here's our example of a service and what it would look like. Oops, double-click that one too fast. So we're going to call it Gift App. A very simple name. It's verb-based, and it describes what the transaction is. We're going to give it a simple class method called execute. We're going to pass in app, gifter, and giftee. We're going to create a purchase for the gifter, and we're going to create an access right for the giftee. So it's a very simple demonstration, but it kind of shows you what services look like so that you know how to build them. Now let's go back to our Rails app. And what do we see? We could create a services folder that has all these different services. Create app, gift app, refund purchase maybe. What we're doing is we're building a list of transactions that are in our domain. And it communicates everything that your domain can do. So if you're going into a project for the first time, you'll see this, and it'll be very obvious where all the different actions in your project. So let's talk about data access. By the way, how am I doing on time? Good? So it really frustrates me when I see where clauses in Rails applications that are kind of just scattered everywhere, and it's not very obvious what's going on. So if I look at this example, okay, we're trying to get apps, and we're trying to find apps that are created less than a week ago, where the purchase count is over 10,000. Okay. But what does that mean? Why am I accessing the data this way? So I give code like this a big fat whack. That is a horse head on a person holding a cat on a boat. So the answer to this is very simple. Rails has a solution. Just use scopes. So in our example of using the scope, we have a very simple name. It says new and noteworthy. So now we know that our app store cares about apps that are new and noteworthy. And now we understand why retrieving that data the way we are makes sense to the domain. So let's go back to our app and take a look at it again. Now we have a list of scopes, and we have a list of behaviors as we talked about before. So we're starting to build this one expressive point of entry. If you want to do anything with a release, a version, or version number, or a screenshot, or a customer review, you access all of that through your app. It makes it very simple for developers to interact with these objects. It sums up all the things that can happen with an app. And a point that is important to make, you only need to retrieve aggregate roots. So you'll never retrieve a release directly or comments directly. You'll have to retrieve your app and then iterate through your app to get those. So let's look at our Rails project again. So under the models directory, we can represent the aggregates by creating a folder for each aggregate. For this example, we have an apps folder. And in the apps folder, it has the app, it has the release, it has a review, the screenshot, and the version number. We also have customers and sellers because those are also aggregates. So let's summarize what we just learned. So we learned that we should continuously refine the domain with a domain expert. Number 2, we insist on having a ubiquitous language for seamless communication throughout the team and in the code. Number 3, we want to constrain relationships to only what the domain needs. Number 4, we want to create aggregates that express domain concepts and manage complexity. And number 5, we create value objects to eliminate unnecessary complexity. Number 6, we create services to express transactions between aggregates. And 7, we express the domain's intent through well-defined data access. So this is what we started with, a Rails project that makes no note of the domain, and we ended up with a Rails project that describes exactly how our domain works, what are the entry points, and this will make it very easy for new developers to come in and understand what's going on. So some quick pro tips. Don't let your database diverge too far from your domain model. So they do want to have some differences. For example, we didn't have a screenshots table. We serialized that into the release table. And that's good because we wanted to make it a value object. But you don't want to get to the point where you do that so much that they're so different and then it becomes confusing. Don't try to build and maintain a huge diagram of your domain. It's very difficult to maintain that. It's going to get outdated. It's a waste of time. Don't do it. The better thing to do is just, if you have to rehash a new domain concept, write it up on a whiteboard and then discuss it. But ultimately, your source of truth is in your code. Separate your domain logic from your view logic. There's a lot of patterns for this: view models, presenters, form views. And also check out the gem fig leaf. You can use it to privatize certain active record methods in your active record model. So for instance, if you wanted the where clause to be private, you can do that. Then nobody can use the where clause outside of that active record object, which then forces you to use your scope to specify data access. So that was a lot in a short amount of time. I'll also be putting these slide decks on my website. Thank you for listening. Really appreciate it. My handle on Twitter is MJEZZI. I have a website, MikeAbiEzzi.com. I'll put the slides up there in a few days. Thank you for QuickLeft for flying me out here. And then a special thanks to Virtual Genius for being a domain mentor of mine. Anybody have any questions?